The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Welcome to the show. This week, we're going to take a dive back into the world of, well, purity culture, patriarchy, heavy Christian evangelical belief, and what that can do to a person's life. Because there are lots of good reasons that people have for believing things, and it gives them a great deal of comfort and a great deal of community and a great deal of good in their life. But there is a dark side to religion and religious belief in the United States. And I have, I'm not going to belabor this point right now. I want to get to my guest and get into this, but that's what we're going to be discussing in the show today, and talking about someone's personal story about this. I am welcoming this week Tia Levings. She has written a book, which is coming out very soon. We're going to talk about that. Tia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
It's okay, good. Yeah. I'm happy to have you. I'm a little energetic about having you, actually, so I'm sorry. I don't want to cut you off. You have been doing a number of interviews recently about a book you have written. What is this book called, and when and where will people be able to get their hands on it? Let's lead with that, so I don't forget to mention that.
Yeah, I'm the author of A Well-Trained Wife. It's my memoir, my escape from Christian patriarchy. It's the story of how I got into and out of a violent marriage and a violent religion. And it's the same religion that's taking over our country now. So I wrote my book partially as a memoir, but also partially as a warning so that people would know what it's really like to live in the Christian patriarchy.
Perfect timing, and something that I am more than a little concerned about, and have been speaking about on my channel recently, Project 2025, and has been blowing up on social media recently. But that is something that, while as disturbing as it is, for years on this channel, I've been discussing with former members of groups connected with, exactly the same thing you were. The dangers of this, the very real societal threat that is presented by large groups of people believing that it's okay to take away people's rights. And that's kind of what we're dealing with your story. What group were you part of, and how did you and your family become part of it? Maybe we'll just kind of start with the origin story.
Yeah. I think it's important. My background is because the temptation is to hear a story like mine and think that it's extreme or fringe, and not very relatable as a result. But the truth is, I grew up in the largest Southern Baptist megachurch in the South in the 80s and 90s. My pastor was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so I was very, very mainstream in my upbringing. This was around the same time, like the same 20-year, 30-year span that the evangelical church movement was politicizing and also becoming more fundamentalist in nature. So that definitely did tighten control as I grew up. But it was the church with, it's the mainstream, everyday, Lifeway Christian bookstores, VeggieTales, Christianity that people encounter. Nothing weird about it. And then it moved. I married at 19 and asked an older woman for advice on how to get my baby to sleep. And I found myself in Bill Gothard's Institute of Basic Life Principles. And then we pretty much follow the trajectory of the movement at that point. So as we talk, you'll hear me mention different leaders and books and movements that they're all adjacent to one another. It is like a chain of dominoes. One leads to the other as we go.
Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, all too familiar. The Gothard dogma, you could say, the 7 biblical principles and all that, are a masterclass in biblical manipulation and reinterpretation that even in the broader Christian world, people have written books. Yeah, no, this guy got it really wrong when it comes to this. Just so I'll know, because I really don't know, where do you stand now after having been through all the things we're going to discuss here today, including the summary you just gave? where do you stand now in terms of belief? Did it affect or alter your personal beliefs?
I think it completely revolutionized who I am in my personal self-development. I escaped viscerally. It was a very violent escape, 2007, and I began 12 years, 13 years of trauma therapy from there. So that really was the discovery of my selfhood and my growth. How I answer that question today about belief is I like to answer it and then explain why I answer it this way. I identify now as a spiritually private person, and that is specifically because faith and religion are private, and that should have been private autonomy given to me as a young child. Instead, my rights were violated from the start, where I'm told to make a decision for my eternity at age 5, basically, and we ask people these probing questions about their personal faith, and that what that does is it boxes us in. Now we're pressured to give the right answer, the answer we think the person wants to hear, and also we're confining ourselves, which faith is fluid. It's an exploration and curiosity and growth, and is meant to evolve with us. And so I don't put myself into a box anymore. I let myself have a private practice and a fluid exploration, and I don't identify with a congregational group anymore. And I really am centered on survivors and telling stories of abuse and educating on the abuses and the fruit of these high control systems more than I am in cheerleading or supporting.
That's awesome. I love that
Yeah.
answer. Thank you. That's
You're
great.
welcome. Hard fought. Those are hard fought answers.
Yeah, I get that. They're
Yeah.
highly considered and well considered, and I very much respect that answer. It occurs to me while you were saying it, I kept thinking to myself, wow, what if, like voting, what if we didn't wear our heart on our sleeve when it came to
Mhm.
our views on things? What if it was just kind of okay to just not go there? Wouldn't
I
that
really
be a
hope
different
that
society?
people
Mm-hmm.
know who I am through my character. I hope my
Mm-hmm.
character shines, and I hope that's enough for them. Like, I do believe we should have some respect for privacy, and also I think we should know something about the people that we're affiliating closely with their work. But there's boundaries. I didn't grow up with boundaries. I didn't grow up with any kind of boundary, and in any regard. So um, having having personal boundaries now is important.
Absolutely. It's awesome. Okay, so grew up large Southern Baptist, run of the mill, mainstream, yet not totally mainstream. Your life changes at some point and goes into this more patriarchal, men are in charge umbrella of Jesus, protection from the darts of Satan, all that. We've covered that in detail on this channel. You guys can check out my other stuff on the IBLP and ATI and Bill Gothard. We go into detail on the belief set. So when did that change happen, and what effects did that have on you personally? Just again, as part of the
Yeah.
origin story.
I want to be like really clear when I describe it is that it was not a pivot. This was more of a layer upon a layer upon a layer kind
Right.
of evolution. And my church that I grew up with, while it looked white, wealthy, and mainstream, it was actually just as high control. It just had a softer sell. It was more like we were on TV, and we had like very populist power in our city. We had 11 city blocks downtown. Definitely had a huge influence on the culture around us, but it wasn't as I would say puritanical in the aesthetic as the Gothardites. So around the same time, this is about 5 years before the Duggars come on the scene. And if people are familiar with the Duggar family, they're all wearing the long jumpers, and this is the beginning of the homeschool movement, and especially pre 9/11, it was kind of fringe and finding its feet, and then it exploded onto the scene after 9/11. But it was still like a Little House on the Prairie aesthetic, and it was this very shiny ideal of, it's the fundamentalist formula. You want a happy life, you want a happy marriage, you want children who obey. Here's the steps you should take, and this is the result that we promise you'll get. The promise never manifests the way they say it will, which is why I do the work that I do today. but they don't, lead with the results. There's no like, here are success stories and you can trust this. This is all like, it's all idealism being sold to us. So there's a verse in the Bible, Titus 2, it says, let the older women teach the youngers to be keepers at the home, love their husbands. It's a mentorship model. And so when I married somebody I barely knew, which was a very promoted practice in our church, which was their whole goal was to make sure we were all virgins on our wedding day. Nobody had sex outside of marriage, which meant you had to get married really quick. And your job is to be a Christian wife and mother was your one job. So quick, get married quick. Well, I got married quick, and it was somebody I didn't know very well and certainly didn't present with his reality. He was very charming. They turned out to be an abuser. And I didn't know what abuse was. I had no language or vocabulary to interpret what was happening to me from the start, but I also knew I didn't have a way out. There was no divorce allowed. There was no, I couldn't talk to anybody about what I was experiencing. But when I became pregnant, I knew that a baby crying at night was going to increase his erraticism and make him tired and increase the violence. And it was no longer just me that was going to experience that violence. Now it was my baby. And I was really interested in being protective of my baby. So I asked this older mother for help. And the Bill Gothard's evangelistic model is the people would come to the conventions for biblical principles, so they're coming from all different denominations to his events, these large stadium events. And then they're dispersing into their churches to recruit within churches. So I had observed this family for years. They had organ rows of children. Have you ever seen organ pipes? They're graduated by note. And that's how their children were, like they had these long pew lines of children. And they'd been spreading in our church as these extra holy people, these devout families that we all just kind of respected and looked up to. But didn't necessarily want to live that way, was the mainstream idea. But I needed her advice. And I thought, oh, hey, a professional mother, somebody who's had 10 kids can certainly help me with my one little baby. And I'd been a nanny, so I wasn't worried about like the baby care part of it, but I was interested in the spiritual instruction and running a household. I was young, 19 years old. And so she did. That's because she was there. Her model was to mentor, and my request was to be mentored. The system was already established for that, and so began my instruction.
Wow. And how old were you when you reached out to her and that began?
19, 20. Yeah.
19, 20. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely young wife.
Mm-hmm.
Married at 18?
19.
19.
Yeah.
Okay. Just gotten married. And when you say not very long that you'd known this man, who was he to you? How did you meet this man, and how did that marriage happen? It wasn't an arranged marriage with the parents, or was it? Or
no, it wasn't courtship, although courtship was rising as a concept and was definitely being talked about by my friends. No, I met him through a ministry. He was in the Navy, and in Jacksonville, Florida is a Navy town. And so our church had a military ministry, and he, his ship got stationed there. So he came to the big church in town, and we met December 1st. We were engaged by January 1st, and we were married the following December.
My goodness, that is certainly
and
whirlwind.
that was preached. Both of our pastors, we had co-pastors, biggies in the Baptist movement. Both of them had 2-week engagements, and that this was our culture.
Wow. And I thought I'd pulled a fast one in the Sea Org, because I had met my wife and gotten married, and we ended up being married for 17 years. I think our whole beginning to end was, let me see, June, July, August. Yeah, 3 months. And I thought I was like Speedy Gonzalez. Wow, a month. Okay.
Yeah.
And when did the red flags start appearing in that relationship, before or after the marriage vows?
6 weeks after meeting him, right after we were engaged, as soon as I was secured. And I didn't know to call them red flags. We didn't have that language back then.
Right.
But I was hesitant, and I was starting to have, it was moving too quickly for me.
Mm-hmm.
A big thing with me now is nervous system regulation. And one of those like gifts I give myself is time to acclimate to changes. And this is how I learned it, because when things start to change very quickly for me, I get overwhelmed and dysregulated. And I can look back in my journals, and certainly in writing the book, I was able to identify that, oh, I was dysregulated and doubting and asking questions and wanting to slow things down. And he was pushing, pushing, pushing because he was unable to mask long term. Like that's his real motivator was that he knew he needed to get going. We need to get to the marriage. And um, it was a violent engagement. It should not have become a marriage, but I did not. The churches don't do any education on what abuse looks like or how it manifests. They'll say things like, don't stay in an abusive relationship, but then they're not telling you anything about anything, whether it's your body, how it works, what sex is like, what it should be like. There's no education to any of that. So when it happens to you, I just always interpret it as my fault. Like I clearly did something that made him mad, or I can see where I wasn't right in this situation. I should ask him for forgiveness. I said something the wrong way, or I did something that set him off, and he was really good at blaming me. So he would say things like, well, you just have such a temper. And this was after my reaction to something he'd done to me, like, because I was scared. And I just didn't have any framework at all. There was no understanding for what was happening to me.
Right. Within the framework that you did have, because we're always struggling to explain things within the knowledge and data we have, and we don't know what we don't know,
Right.
which is sort of our doom as human beings.
Definitely.
So what I'm looking at is of course, in retrospect, as we're walking through the story, and when I'm asking about red flags and things like that, it's more from a point of how do we, there's a lot of people who just have no idea how this works.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what I'm trying to do and walk through this is like, well, what could people see that what should you have seen? And you say, well, it became violent. That obviously should have been, a huge thing. But within the knowledge you had at the time, it seems to me it was, I'm supposed to submit. I'm supposed to be the one who's supportive. I'm supposed to be the homemaker. This is my job. Mm-hmm. So clearly I'm failing at my job if he's angry at me. So is that right? Am I thinking along the same right
it's
line?
Exactly that. Those are the almost word for word what I was thinking at the time. We used to have this song that we sang, little as much as if God is in it. And it was the idea that you can take anything, but God will bless it if you work hard enough at it. And that was the messaging. Marriage is hard. So I was predisposed to believe it was hard. And the idealism of romance was very saccharine and superficial. So there's not anything underneath that to help me, interpret anything. So I stayed on the saccharine and superficial level and tried to convince myself that I loved him and tried to really dig in and make this do the best I could. It's but 19 years of indoctrination that if something goes wrong, it's my sin that caused it.
Yeah.
I didn't have another lens.
Exactly. And that puts you in a position where people outside may judge you for choices that you weren't even aware you could make.
Right. There were no choices.
Right. And that's what really gets me about the way our society deals with this stuff is the amount of judgment that comes in because of, well, I know better, therefore you should have known better. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your indoctrination because I think it's key to understanding the story. And it goes beyond stuff I even was aware of, which is why I wanted to ask you about it. You mentioned in some other interviews you did that there were films you were shown as a child in school. The idea of being raptured was a very real thing, and here's a movie showing it to you, and here's what's going to happen to people who have sexually deviant thoughts and stuff. And I was just like, what? It's at this level that they are actually indoctrinating these kids, because I was kind of thinking from the time, and from what I've learned about this, that it was mainly through biblical scripture or memorization or preaching or telling you how bad this stuff was. But I guess I just didn't realize they were making movies about this and showing it to children. Could you elaborate on what your life was like growing up, what this education was about?
Yeah, let's go back to Seven Mountains because one of the mountains is entertainment. So they got to have this Christian entertainment arm. And my church was part of the production of that. You know, we had very wealthy church. And so um, I'm sure we were donating money to studios and I'm sure things like that were happening. But also Christianity, mainstream evangelicism was moving in that direction. Lifeway Christian bookstores came on the scene. Lots of Christian books and materials. And so this America within America, there's a verse, be in the world, but not of it. And so we wanted to have we still wanted to have music and movies and things like that. So Christian contemporary music comes on the scene, CCM, and movies that help reinforce what we're being preached on Sundays. So it's the same messaging told many different ways, marketed to us and reinforced over and over and over again, so that what we heard on Sunday was very consistent with what we saw in movies and the music that we were listening to and the conversations that we're having with our friends. And so they just build upon one another so that it's this invisible brick that surrounds you. And the world doesn't think you're that different. Like they think you're weird, but they don't really understand what you're being taught. And you don't second guess anything you're hearing because it's the only thing that you hear. So it's around you over and over and over again. And these are from very young ages. You know, I went to that school when I was 11 years old, and this is the same time they're telling us not to watch R-rated movies or even PG-13. I think PG-13 became a thing when I was a kid. Um, it had been just PG before that, and there was this awkward gap between PG and R-rated content.
That's
And
right.
then they're showing us this at school. You know, like our parents are paying money to send us to these private schools so that we can avoid segregation. Big deal in the South. The white Christian schools to get to not be part of the forced busing that was happening to blend our schools. And they thought that we were getting a better education, and what we really were getting was just reinforcement in the religious indoctrination that we were surrounded in all the time. It's like this
Right.
your 7 days a week story, you know.
Jesus. How is the patriarchy aspect of that reinforced with that? Is it always about heroic men and submissive women, or what? Like, how do they
Yes.
present this to you?
It's always about defined gender roles. It's always about super feminine women dependent on super masculine men of one kind. There are jobs that men can do and jobs that women can do, and they're perfectly suited by design, and everyone's the same. You know, it becomes very cookie cutter. The authority structures are all male. There's no women in leadership. There's women in helping roles. So women can be teachers if they're teaching children. They can be preschool workers. You know, all of our deacon boards would have one token woman, and she was the head of preschool. Um, so, and of course, only the pastors are preaching. It, you're saturated. You're just,
Right.
there's no, not that. There's no place in your life where it's not that.
Right. And then, so as you mentioned earlier, so aptly, this America within America,
Hmm.
this sort of, this sort of separate bubble world, if you will. And I'm, having been in the Sea Org, you're literally right in the middle of Hollywood. We were
Yes.
in these big
Uh-huh.
blue buildings, and we might as well have been on Mars.
Hmm.
We were surrounded by industry, businesses, hospitals, restaurants, and none of it existed for us.
Right.
We're simply cloistered in our world, geographically and psychologically. And I
Hmm.
kind of relate that to this experience where the indoctrination, and we have to call it that because this goes well beyond just education and facts and figures.
Hmm.
There's a whole culture that exists here. And I'm wondering, how did you, or what mechanisms were in place, in hindsight, looking back at it, to prevent you from being corrupted by the bigger world outside the bubble?
They kept us so busy. Number one, time, and they promised that, told our parents, send your kids to church and we'll keep them so busy that they'll stay straight. And straight meant, sexually, but it also meant, obedient. Our instruction, really started in baby nursery, they're teaching us these stories, really violent Bible stories, things we have no business teaching. One of the things that I've been honing in on lately is realizing how close in proximity, actual physical proximity, we often were to mandatory reporters. Um, without realizing it. People who should have been able to see some signs of something's not right, or you shouldn't be teaching a child that way, or you shouldn't be striking that child. And we had the audacity, we were kind of bred into the audacity that we could be who we are in front of people, but they cannot touch us. And there is no way you can cry for help, because the people around you are going to respect you as these, upstanding people or good families, or whatever, this enviable part of culture. And I think that moral code is like part of something that we're dealing with now, where they really think they're setting a good example of a way to live. And it comes down to this common sense. Well, don't you want your children to grow up in this, great environment, and have, like, the Ten Commandments in schools is a great example. Don't you
Right.
want your children to know right or wrong from the Ten Commandments? And there's so much wrong with that, but it's also like this presupposition that kids are only going to learn it if the Christians teach it, and that there's nothing wrong with what the Christians are teaching, so that you can attach to this one piece of it, and not the outcome. And so the kids are there was no way to ask for help, but they were standing right there. Mandatory reporters were right there. And then we're existing in plain sight. And I'm sure you, like, in Scientology, encountered that too, because you're in the middle of it. You're in the
Yeah,
middle of it, but you're somehow invisible.
that's right. That's
And
right.
that gets in your head, like, there's really nowhere to turn. But of
Well,
course
and
there is, right there.
that's exactly. See, there's a learned
Yeah.
helplessness here
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that is just absolutely fascinating to have experienced it and learn about it and go, oh, that's what that was. But for people on the outside, they just but why can't you just, and it's almost like you're talking with battered wives, well, which you were.
Right.
What do you mean walk away? What are you talking about? This is my entire world. You don't
Mm-hmm.
just get up and walk away from that, right? It
Right.
it, it takes a great deal of experience or whatever before you're finally able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I just wanted to lay this groundwork so people were clear on what it was who you were
Mm-hmm.
going into this relationship in this world, that it wasn't just about you,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, who I was going into that relationship was a very sweet, a very naive young girl who had marriage and relationships completely romanticized. I really did believe that my purity, and the purity that I had been protecting for all of these years through all of my choices, all the dying to self that I had done, all the straight and narrow I'd stayed on, all the choices I'd made, and put away the things of the world, that so I could have this result, was going to result in happily ever after. I called them Christian princesses because I really believed I was one, and I had stayed pure for marriage, and my prince had come, and now I was going to have this wonderful Anne of Green Gables life. And I love Anne of Green Gables and Anne of Ingleside. And she had, um, you know, eight kids, seven, eight kids. She's a fictional character, but to me, she was very real. And I just really thought that, with enough love, and I'm an optimist by nature anyway, so with enough love and hard work and Midwestern work ethic and God, that everything would be fine. Um, Nothing really could be further from the truth, but it's been the story of my life. My character arc is coming to terms with that was a pipe dream. That was a fantasy that I was sold so that I would cooperate in a system and uphold an ideal that didn't have anything about me, the person, the human being at its core. And I had no self-development. I was a people pleaser. I was a fawner. I was um, very perfectionistic and afraid to get anything wrong. I had an eating disorder and I didn't know it. I would have, I fit in very well. I was very good example of what they hoped to produce as fruit for their youth group.
Right. No, exactly. And very compliant.
Hmm. Exactly.
Uh, yeah, it's a culture of compliance, and it's interesting how everything you've said, really, if you look at it through that lens for a second, and look at all these forces are aligned and arrayed to do exactly what you just described, of putting you in a mental headspace where you are trapped.
Hmm.
You're trapped in this sort of faux paradise that is not any such thing. And of course, the reality of your situation was so starkly not that eventually you woke up to that. Let's talk about that now. What was your arc there from marriage to what the hell's going on here?
Yeah. Well, see how many feet in the air we want to go from it.
Sure.
My honeymoon, my wedding night involved 3 rapes. So I mean, it really
Mm.
was from the get-go, from the very first time my big reality check was that no, this was not going to be happily ever after. And that really set the stage and put into place this process of learning to navigate and tiptoe around abuse. Um, we were being, coached to become quiverful, which is the idea that you don't use birth control and you have as many babies as possible. I, of course, had a lot of misgivings about that. My parents weren't like this. They just took me to church. My parents just wanted us to go to the big church downtown, and we were religious family, but not fundamentalist. Um, and so I just expected that I would have a few kids, or I would space them out, or I would have them over a long period of time. But I did have hesitancies about having unlimited children, for as long as you're fertile. That's not something that I was really excited about. Also, I could tell my young husband, like part of taking care of a young husband and helping him be successful, he was not coping well with this much responsibility. And so my whole job was to lessen his burden and be a good helpmeet to him. So I was trying to take on as much workload as possible, so that I could relieve him, and then I kept getting pregnant. So in 10 years, 10 years, I had 9 pregnancies, 5 live births, and 4 surviving children. And that's kind of low on the report card. Quiverful moms usually have a lot more than that. Um,
The Duggars, for example, would be
yeah,
the
for
poster
example.
children for this, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're all
Mm.
Irish twins. Um, yeah, and so it just life didn't nothing went the way that was promised. My third baby, I talk about her all the time. She's part of what cracked my whole spell, the whole magic spell. Her name is Clara. She was born with a heart defect in 1999, and I had never really encountered external hardship before. Everything had been to this point had been um secret hardship behind closed doors, but on the outside we look like a really great example of a young couple that loves Jesus and has had young children, and aren't they beautiful, and they're just doing such a good job, and look at them being simple and old fashioned and all the good things. There's no reason to look at us and see any kind of red flag or detraction, because we just looked like that nice young couple with the young children. But my daughter's heart defect was completely out of our control. We couldn't do anything about it. I had to step out of place and time in order to address her surgical needs. That is the first time in my life I was surrounded by women who went to college and became nurses and social workers and physicians and surgeons. So I was around women, different kinds of women, this way, and I was in an environment where there was no fundamentalists and really no God. I mean, at Children's Hospital, nothing plays by the rules that you expect, So the entire experience of Clara's life and eventual death was outside of time, and it changed me. It changed me in ways I couldn't go back and become who I had been. It was irrevocable. And I'm so grateful. Her means clarity, and that's what she always gave me, was a sense of clarity. But she helped me break out of some of the mind control that I had been under, and I still stayed another 7 years physically. The physical control continued, but the um the arguing and the challenging and the questioning and independence and all of that, is like my BC. There's before Clara and after Clara, and I'm a different person after that point.
Mm. All right, I get that. Totally get that.
Yeah.
I usually talk about, I don't try to fit everybody into this bucket, right? But usually waking up from, the cult, quote unquote, involves a moral outrage, a moral break of some kind, right? Some right and wrong that is so clear that is undeniable. You can't avoid it. You can't, because we avoid a lot as cult
Yeah.
members. We deny a lot. We have years of it building up and no, 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 and nah, I don't think so, and reframing things or re-explaining things. But finally, something happens, or a
Hmm.
series of things happens, maybe smaller things that build up, and then it's just, oh, yeah, I can't. There's no reclassifying this. This is
Yes.
bad.
Yes.
What was that for you with Clara and that experience?
it was an assumption that I was supposed to get over it. I was supposed to move on, give
Ah,
God the glory for her life and death, and stop talking about her because infant death makes people really uncomfortable. And at first, that's not true. Every time I share about her, it opens the door for someone else to share their story. And it's actually been life-giving to share her story over and over again. But they told me, we're uncomfortable with you talking about it all the time. The right thing to do is to get pregnant again quickly and just move on. And I could not pretend she had not existed. Not only was I completely different, but I had promised her that I would not let her life be in vain. And I felt like this person came and impacted, and there's just something that's so unjust about infant death. Like it's just, and the children's hospital experience and as a whole, there's so much injustice involved in it that it was just incredulous to me that they were going to expect that I was just going to go on as if nothing happened. And
right.
that's what they do, though. They go on as if nothing happens. Their stories are riddled with tragedy, but they pat it away and they bypass and they, take anything that's unpleasant and don't talk about that. And you're supposed to just pick up and move on as if nothing happened. And I couldn't do it.
Right. It's supposed to be this very sort of, well, it's idyllic and everything is idyllic. And so these things that make it not that way, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're just not
Because they
gonna,
have to immediately answer the question like, well, we prayed for her. Well, how could God let her die?
right.
Well,
That's right. That's
yeah,
right.
it
It's a
was
tough
that one.
question. That's a tough question.
Yes.
And nobody really has good answers to that
Right.
in or out of those communities. So, okay. So then your husband. So, because you seem to indicate here and some other stuff I watched with you that your parents were not particularly a huge part of this problem when it came to patriarchal, indoctrination, and you must be a good wife and we're going to beat you into submission as your
No, not at
parents.
all.
That's not what happened here.
No.
Often that is what happens. And there are
Yes.
many second gens whose parents are monsters. I mean, I've had some interviews with people that were horrifying when it came to the
Yes.
parental relationships, but not you.
Right.
And kudos, right? I'm glad, I'm happy about that. And yet the social structures and pressures were so great that they pushed you right in this direction anyway.
Yeah.
So so the parents aren't really the issue, but then this guy gets involved. You mentioned he was in the Navy. Was he a hardcore Gothard believer himself when he met you, or where was he coming from with all this?
Yeah, he was a Southern boy from a small town, went to church on Sunday. His mom took him because his dad didn't go. He had a lot of trauma in his childhood and chaos that he was trying to solve for. He had mental disorganization that he was trying to solve for. So there were reasons in his life where external control was very attractive. And we were just in the right place at the right time in the right soup. Like if we'd had therapists, it would be a different story.
Mm.
If we'd had language to say, oh, hey, this marriage isn't going the way, this isn't healthy, like this hurts, this is wrong, like it would have been different, but we didn't have any of that. What we had was a church saying, you should stay married at all costs. Here's a system for you to improve your family. Don't worry about it if it's hard, or if there's problems. Everybody has them. And so I call it church sanctioned domestic abuse because at every turn, the church was encouraging us to, number one, stay married above all costs, and that all of these problems could be solved with their system, always with this answer, always with this system. And so authority was supposed to solve it, holy living, devotion, simple life. Not doing certain things. I have a series of videos where I say ordinary parenting things my Gothard Fundy mentors said I could skip in order to have a quiverful. And these were a whole bunch of lifestyle practices that we take for granted that are part of raising children that we would just skip because it's easier to be married and have lots of children if you don't have to go to the pediatrician, you don't need the gynecologist, you don't have to educate your daughters, don't worry about academics, you don't get toys for them. Don't worry, they don't need separate bedrooms. Like there's just a whole list of things that parents would factor into the cost and effort of having kids that we just skip
And
completely.
wow, okay. And did you find that to be specific to you guys, or was that
Huh.
another cultural
That's
thing that's
practice wide.
just
That's practice
practice?
wide.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
all around. It's just
Mhm.
just child abuse central, and this is normalized.
it is the entire encapsulation of the Duggars TV show. The Duggars are lifestyle evangelists, and that lifestyle that they're preaching is one that doesn't use contraception, doesn't rely on doctors, doesn't educate their girls, is hyper modest. It's the thing. That's the world.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It's cloistered, closed off world that praises or seems to idealize ignorance.
Yes. It requires ignorance because
Yeah.
knowledge empowers people.
Right. Right. And this is, of course, where, we who are not in that world look at that and have to judge harshly because we know the benefits of education. and and as met when you started meeting with doctors and trained professionals, oh wow, there's a whole different world out here that's not
Mhm.
this abusive, cloistered, I have no choices, I'm the only solution to every problem is submit and pray, and somehow things are supposed to work themselves out, and that when tragedy strikes they don't work themselves out, you're left to
Mhm.
just deal with it. And oh, you can't, well, shut up and just keep praying, and that seems to be the height of the solutions that are offered in this. Am I getting that wrong?
No, that's completely right. They're flowerier, with how they say it. It might be in paisley. It might get sold as a plaque on your wall, and the message is don't disrupt, stay the course. Suffering is aligning with Christ. It's okay if love hurts. They're
Hmm.
they just keep you in line with this idea that it's supposed to be hard. And point for point, everything they said was going to happen to me on the outside didn't manifest. And once I had language for what happened, I did start to see things clearly. So their whole effort was in denying that language, denying that education, making sure we didn't have access to it. Because as soon as we know that any point, any scientific point, for example, corporal punishment, as soon as we know to take that seriously, now we have a question and a doubt. Now we're less cooperative. We're not. And if you don't switch your infants, like one of the practices is blanket training, where you start switching your infants at 4 months, which I could not do. Um, but once you introduce that, like that's where the indoctrination begins, because you're teaching children from infancy to cooperate, shut down their emotion centers, shut down their education, and don't offer them any other alternative, so that there is no choice making here. This is get in line.
That's right. It's a very simple life model.
Hmm.
Do what we say,
Yeah.
do what it says there, don't ask questions,
Right.
comply, and stop complaining.
Yes. They managed to make that a good sales pitch. If you notice today in politics, the same thing is being talked about.
Mm,
And um, and people, it appeals to people because they're like, well, maybe I should just get in line. Maybe those Dems or whoever the other is should just get in line, and we shouldn't have these conversations anymore. It's a subtle siren call.
that's right. That's exactly right. It appeals to a mindset that seeks simple answers to
Mhm.
complex questions, and questions that are truly overwhelming for a lot of people, and rightfully so. The economy, the world affairs, all that. What am I supposed to do about any of that? I'd rather just have a nice tunnel vision, simple situation, simple life. You tell me what to do, I'll do it, and everything's going to be great. That appeals to
Right.
so many people.
Yeah. Yeah.
What we have, though, unfortunately, at least as far as I can tell, is an outmoded belief set where it becomes one of enforced compliance, and learned helplessness,
Mhm.
that springs from a centuries-old Protestant idea that suffering is the feature, not the bug of life.
Right.
That this is how you prove your worth to God, and at the end of the day, you get in because you suffered. You put your nose to the grindstone. You did your work. You said your prayers. This is old school, and it comes to the American shores, and here we are. The problem is that our knowledge base has grown greatly from the old Martin Luther days. And we
Yes.
don't have to suffer in silence and put our nose to the grindstone because we have modern solutions to these problems. But
Yes.
this is a culture that seems to glorify the ignorance, right? So no, we can't have any of those solutions. We can't have any of this in our life because that's not godly,
Right. Right.
right? Isn't it wild?
It's wild to me because they, at the same breath, will say that God is all powerful and all knowing. And but yet their God needs us to be counterproductive and live as if it was 2 centuries ago, live as if we haven't learned any lessons, we haven't advanced as a society. Whereas an all-knowing, all-powerful God should be not only perfectly fine with our advancements, but probably helped get us there, like
Exactly.
wants to keep expanding. An expanding universe actually glorifies God, not a restrictive one. So it's
Exactly, which is kind of what Newton and the original, the Reformation and the scientists and all of that, that is literally what they were thinking when they were developing this stuff is I'm doing this to discover God's greater picture here, not
yes.
to deny him or say there, or any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, somehow it all just kind of got a little crazy, but
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a little bit more in terms of okay, so you did get out of this abusive, physically, psychologically violent situation.
Mm.
Were there other lessons along the way as a battered wife and mother that you wanted to share today or that we should know about as part of this story of, what were red flags you could have seen or should have seen or could see in retrospect that had you, you know, acted earlier or something that could have been different?
I get a question a lot of is people who have family members who they know are involved in high control religion and in fundamentalist practices, and they're wondering how they can help. And they always ask me like, what would you have responded to when you were in these years, particularly that second 7 years where I am more engaged with. We're in the Reformed traditions now, so it's the Doug Phillips Vision Forum and Doug Wilson's in program Federal Vision in Idaho, who is still so prolific today. Um, he, I was more engaged in the community. We were in Boy Scouts. We were in American Heritage Girls, which is like Christian patriotic Girl Scouts. I took my kids to the library. I had started to find my feet as a artsy classical education Christian woman, and I got really good at keeping the divorce, the abuse compartmentalized and secreted away, even though it was way more heinous at this point, to the point of wife spanking. I always say that's a spoiler, but it's also a content warning, because these patriarchs teach that women should be disciplined the same as the children, that the husband is responsible to answer to God for the behavior and thoughts of everyone in his family. And so if he's going to face judgment day for the thoughts of his wife, he's going to keep her in line. And how is he going to do that? It's with this discipline. And it's not fringe and it's not unheard of. And it does happen. And where people talk about it more often is with older daughters who are disciplined physically by their fathers until they're courted off to their husbands. Um, Adult women are disciplined in this high control religion, and so the secrets get deeper and darker, and the visibility also rose. So it seemed like to our friends that we're engaged part of the society, and this surely can't be happening, which has helped me hide in plain sight. It's why my parents didn't know what was going on, even though horrible things were happening. Um, I think the things that I responded to were the people who are willing to see me as a human being and engage me in conversation in non-judgmental, threatening ways. Um, these are people who did interact with me at Scouts, and they knew it was the weird homeschoolers. I think a lot of people listening to this will be able to think of a family who are the weird homeschoolers, and and if you're in the homeschooling world, especially, you're interacting with the weird homeschoolers. Um, they're all engaged in some level of neglect and abuse in order to pull off their lifestyle. I do believe that. I'm sure there's a spectrum involved, but that world is that world, and your intuition is correct. And so to be able to stay engaged in relationship and keep the lines of communication open as much as possible can be life-saving. When I was ready to make my escape, it happened a little bit before I planned on leaving. I was going to leave a couple days later, but I did have people kind of lined up to help me get out, and the violence just kind of interrupted it. But I did have a plan, and I was able to go to those people because I had known that they knew enough was wrong that they would help me. Um, but they were also like really respectful of my timeline. When you're ready to go, I'm here for you. I've heard of other people buy grocery cards and give them to people, like in gift cards or different things, because it's untraceable money. And so if you can get the wife some grocery cards, people have joked my book should be handed out without its jacket and say how to be a well-trained wife.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Right.
yeah,
Exactly. How to
look
raise a
for covert
child. Those
ways.
ones.
Yes.
Jesus. Jesus. Okay. Now let's focus in on one aspect of this that I've been curious about for a long time, because I'm sure there are details I am missing. You see these pictures, and as you mentioned, right, those weird homeschoolers, this purity culture.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what they call it inside?
Not really. Not
How
really.
do they refer to
Yeah.
themselves? What's the language?
They just say stay pure. There was a window of time where I don't know if purity balls are still happening and purity rings,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
like that, the word purity would be attached to an item like that or an event. They certainly didn't call it purity culture because that would assume that there's a choice. There's another culture. It's just, it's just
Good
keeping pure.
point.
Yeah,
Good
you're
point.
just you're just in you're obeying God. You're keeping pure, you're protecting your virginity. Um, a lot of emphasis on your purity of thought, deed, and body. So, it's not just sexual purity, it's where your mind goes and what you're advertising through your modesty. And yeah, it's again all encompassing, and it is a culture, but we didn't call it that.
Right, right. And this assumes almost, it seems, in exact parallel with what goes on in Muslim cultures,
Hmm.
that males are simply inexcusably, unjustifiably, completely at the mercy of their hormones
Right.
and have no self-control of any kind whatsoever. And so it's 100% on the women. Stay veiled, stay covered, don't show your shoulders. If I see a calf, it's going to be the end of the world.
Hmm.
Is that right, or am I way off with that? I mean,
No,
are
you're
men
right there.
indoctrinated here, or
Yeah. You're right there. It's ironic because they are preaching from the Bible to us during this time. In the Bible, the scripture actually says if a man lusts, he should pluck his eyes out. It doesn't say anything about the woman's clothing choice.
right?
So, like, I would remember sitting in the pew looking at that and saying, hold on a minute, it doesn't say anything about what I'm wearing. And yet what we're wearing, our dress code, was constant. Our doors were guarded by men who were like looking at our skirt length. And as a mom who is raising babies in this, like I would hear other mothers say, make sure you put tights on your babies because you don't want the men to see their diaper. And the mental math of saying, what are you talking about? You're sexualizing a baby
Yeah,
as if that's a protective measure. And it is a protective measure because they know they have pedos in their midst. They know it's a problem. They know sibling incest is a problem in quiverful homes. They know that pastors are predating on children. They know that the church has got abuse claims that are not addressing. And so there's this like unspoken culture of we will eradicate this abuse and we will protect our daughters by keeping them covered. When in fact, that isn't actually how it works. If you want to protect somebody, you out the secret, you expose what's going on, and you hold someone accountable.
that's right.
And since that's not available to them, they put tights on their babies and say, "Keep your dress down." Like it's completely
I mean,
backwards.
it becomes this really weird inverted thing where, because I was going to ask you, and I am still going to ask you about this, about how the female, about how the women in this culture reinforce this. And yet it's, one way that it had not even occurred to me is out of self-protection.
Yeah,
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 I have to protect my kids, and so I'm going to adopt these measures so that these pedos won't have access to my kids.
yeah,
I mean, my God, you're trapped in a horror movie now.
yeah, yeah. I do call it religious horror. That is what I call it because when something like that dawns on you, there's just no other word for it. It is terror. It is horror. It is beyond the ability to comprehend that this isn't outed, that this is still a problem in 2024. Like, are you kidding me? The original title for my book was called The American Burqa because I, for years, called my denim jumper the American burqa because they had this anger towards Muslims and said, well, we're not fundamentalists like that. We're not putting our women in isolation. Yes, you are. Like, we
That's
just had
exactly what you're doing.
the same thing.
That's exactly what they're doing. And that's what I mean. We can call these people
Yeah.
the American Taliban, right? I've heard that as well.
Yes.
This is, like the parallels are not, they're the same picture. It's like that Office meme. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
like the radical Muslims and the radical Christians. It's the same
Same
picture,
thing.
especially when we're talking about, these gender relationships.
Mm-hmm.
This, of course, I guess I'll assume, but I'm again curious about your experience with this directly. How much of there was there, the anti-LGBT
Mm.
messaging or
Mhm.
or situation there, right? How was that communicated to you as children and as you progressed through your schooling and upbringing?
Yeah, I think my earliest memories of it were sermons in retaliation to what was on TV. So I remember sermons warning us against watching Three's Company. The AIDS crisis was happening. So there was a lot
Okay.
of sermons, and I had dirty pastors that loved to preach sexually explicit sermons, the shock and awe and hell and brimstone. So I was hearing things as a very young child, and this is in my book, like mispronounced STDs. My pastor could not stand lesbians because lesbians chose to not even have a man, like, and that was beyond comprehension for him. And so it wasn't just that they're gay, although they did make fun of gay men constantly. I mean, I remember one sermon where my pastor actually had a glass of milk under his little shelf on the pulpit and a piece of bread, and he showed us what a milk toast was, and he told us this is what a fag is. And I was maybe 12, 13 years old. And so I'm not even hearing respectful language about it. I'm not hearing you should love your neighbor, that this is a creation of God, that you should be, respectful and loving and kind. I think some of that messaging is probably there today, but it was not there in the 80s and 90s. And just hateful, just utterly hateful. Now I couldn't hate. Like I know there were people around me who learned how to adopt hate, but I wasn't somebody who could really do that. It always stuck with me like, but hey, they're people, and didn't Jesus die for them too? And so I was always trying to do the math of this. And probably it's my parents' aspect respect because they did teach me just to love people. Um, and just talk, you treat everybody, with human dignity. But also the AIDS crisis to me was compassion. I felt compassion for that. I didn't feel vitriol. I was like, I hope we find a cure, and I hope these people don't have to die deaths like this. And um, yeah, I mean, it was more of a disease lens, but it was so twisted, so twisted.
Well, the messaging is, if nothing else, we can uncontroversially say that the messaging was incredibly mixed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Next is
and
over.
yeah, and in other words, your family and your Bible and
Mhm.
your
Yeah.
things are teaching you compassion, tolerance, understanding, love, Jesus's love, all that. And then here's this preacher rudely, and grossly discussing, talking sexual behavior and referring to a whole class of people as, as subhuman in some fashion, and
Mhm.
singling them out for targeting. So
Right.
I would imagine with this kind of thing, it's going to be the kind of fire and brimstone. They deserve what is happening to them because of who and what they are.
It was always tied to Sodom and Gomorrah, which it's
Uh-huh.
not even accurately interpreted. There's other things that were happening in Sodom and Gomorrah and it had to do with hospitality. I mean, there were other issues in that I understand as an adult, but I'm always fire and brimstone, and always um that you deserve what's happening to you. This is yeah.
Right. Which is the horrible part to connect a dot back to your child's death,
Hmm.
that it kind of culturally, there's a subtext there that when bad things happen to you, well,
Yeah. Right. This is sin in
mm,
your heart. This is the result. It's either the result of sin in your heart or sin in the world or because Eve ate an apple. Like there's always any explanation except for what actually happened. She
Right.
was born with a heart defect and her body couldn't handle surgery. Like it just can't be that straightforward. It has to have this big spiritual causation that's not related at all.
Exactly. And that's where I've talked about how the concepts of responsibility and even often the word responsibility, but it doesn't look like particularly in this culture or case that word maybe is the way they do it. I don't know. You'll have to tell me. But I'm bringing this up because cult to cult to cult, I've found every single one of them takes the concept of accountability and responsibility and just turns it into mush.
Yeah.
And turns it into something completely wildly abusive.
Mm-hmm.
Where again, every bad thing that happens, oh well, that's 100% on you,
Right.
for hidden
Right.
or obvious reasons, but it's always on you.
Right.
Whereas when anything good happens, it's 100% the church, 100% the cult.
Yeah.
Always give your praises because it's not you that caused that. It was, this other
Right.
thing.
Yeah, it's the miracles are declared in hindsight. I just had a post about the Trump shooting because the time that we're recording this was the
Yeah.
Trump attempted assassination, and the claim now that God had his hand on Trump. Well, but God didn't have his hand on the firefighter?
Right.
Like,
That's right.
what's wrong with that? And then the whole idea of, well, the shooting happened because of sin in the world and the opposition, and they have all these explanations, except for the most obvious one. It's easy to get a rifle and have a shooting in America. Like,
That's right. Even a
that's the
Republican
most
can do it.
straightforward.
That's right. Anybody can do it. I mean,
Yeah.
I know it is such a lesson in confirmation bias and so many other
Circular
logical
logic.
fallacies to watch the interplay of reactions to events like this and watch what people will do with it to forward their agendas. Their agenda is always first
Mhm.
and foremost, and anything else that doesn't align with that,
Right.
well, who cares?
Yep, that's right.
Ugh. Um, Okay, so let's talk more about my question about women, though, because this is something that has plagued me and I've had questions about, and people have asked me about, and I've only had guesswork as to, when I look into the Quiverful movement, I have found books written by women.
Mhm.
This is what you need to do. This is how it's supposed to work. It's not, most of it isn't written by men, it's written by women. I
Right.
found that fascinating and curious, and I figured, well, this is probably a multi-generational problem, and this is just so embedded in the culture that this is a normalized thing. And so how else would it be is probably what I'm imagining these women are coming from. Am I right? Are there other factors? What do
Yeah.
you?
It's more complex than that.
Yeah.
Going back to why I sought my mentor out in the first place, it's the biblical model. Women should teach the women. It's Titus
Oh,
2.
yeah.
And
Right.
so, and it's also a little bit of the spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. So if she's teaching you these things sweetly, then you are more likely to trust them. It takes your sisterhood and your maternal bond with other women completely away and twists it. It is part of the culture that you will have no one to turn to. You won't have your safe sister, your safe mother, your auntie, or you won't have anybody to turn to because the women are reinforcing the patriarchy. In some cases, this is all they can do. Like these are people, human beings with talents and gifts, and they are not allowed to go get jobs and have careers, but they can write a book. They can write a book that supports the ideology, and that is like personally satisfying to them to do that. Um, Another aspect of it is they get empowerment from that. So they get validation and better standing from the men who are in control if they are helping to support the actual patriarchy themselves. And so we see this in patriarchal politics as well. Like women are tapped to represent women, but these are not women we want representing us.
Right.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, I've seen some of those women.
Gross.
Scary. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I
Michelle
also have a
Bachman out
whole
of
thing on.
Minnesota is terrifying woman.
Oh
Just
my goodness, Marjorie Taylor, Lauren Boebert. These are
oh,
not women I want. Amy Coney Barrett. I don't want her representing me on the court. She
right.
doesn't represent the interests of women. She's actually a handmaid in a patriarchal church. Like I don't want that, but that's what we're given, and then it's supposed to be like the woman card. So that happens. There's another element to this. I call them the gentle narcissists, and they're the mothers who they're really embodying what the system is designed to do. So it is generational passed down, and it needs women. The patriarchy doesn't exist without women. It needs women to support and perpetuate it. And so what happens is, because you are in it, you're groomed to become a perpetuator of the patriarchy. And at some point, you're going to become a perpetrator. It happens to all of us. You're either going to discipline your children abusively, you're going to neglect, you're going to become complicit in the system itself, you're going to oppress viewpoints, you're going to participate in a body of people oppressing another body of people. Like, there's no scenario where you are innocent in this, because you are now part of the system and you are helping carry it along. And I think it's one of the big cons of Christianity, actually.
I
That's why
agree.
we're not allowed to think about it critically.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been critical of it for a very long time.
Yeah.
I mean, not knowing or having been raised in the culture, because I wasn't, I came up in a whole different system,
Mm-hmm.
just as oppressive, but very different in a very different way. So we didn't have a patriarchy. We were very, very much not that. Women and men in my world were very much equals. In most ways. I mean, it's not like there weren't criminals or predators in that world, but it wasn't that way. So I'm always fascinated by this, and I've always looked back all the way to Genesis, where it seems fairly obvious to me that women are objectified and made the scapegoat for everything wrong. And it seems to me pretty obvious. I don't have to get super metaphorical or allegorical to see. Wow, the message is pretty damn clear from Genesis
Right.
forward that women screwed it all up.
Yes.
So, and people tell me, no, you're oversimplifying. No,
Yeah,
it's
it
not.
says that on the page.
It seems pretty clear to me, and you're put in this substandard role as a result, where your job is to, again, submit. Man, but yeah, I see but the complications you point out about how women can actually rise and get some degree of power delegated to them by forwarding the system they're in, of course, right? It's the same way in Scientology, where women rise to positions of power and command, but never to the top position, of course. It's
Right.
always going to be a guy, Interesting. Where do they see this going?
Mm-hmm.
What does this culture of people and the leadership of it, what do they actually want? Do they really imagine world domination? Is that where this goes? Or is this like, we want our place and we want people to leave us the hell alone and fenced off, or what, or something in the middle? What is this?
No, dominionism is exactly what it sounds like. It's dominion, and it just goes all the way back to the beginning, where they believe God's made them. That's the job of Christian men, of eventually Christian. We have to get through the Bible to get to Christians, but
Right.
that they are to have dominion over the earth. And so they're going to start with the American government, and they're going to, it's power. It's all power. Like, that's the end goal, is all um being in charge, being the ones in control.
Okay.
I know there's a lot of peripheral messaging around, well, it's to preach the gospel so that all men will be saved. Or it's because Christian values lead to a more productive society. As soon as they say that, I'm like, look at the fruit. No, that's not true. We have a pluralistic society for a reason. And we've learned that lesson in history multiple times. But that's what I was raised in, was the idea that if the Christianity has the answer to all the world's problems, and if we can convert everyone to our way of thinking, it'll just be easier for everyone if everyone agrees with us, and we will be in control, and we will take dominion of first America, and we will be the city on a hill. So first from the Bible, and then we'll spread across the planet. And so that's why we have this like continued tension against Muslims. We have this threat from any other viewpoint or ideology honing in on ours, and they are very content to play a very long game. I mean, the strategy of Project 2025 is about 50 years old. It's not something that's new with each presidency. Like, that's one of their defenses, is like presidencies just toss these around every 4 years. That's bullshit. They've had this thing in place since 1973 through every presidency, and the mandate for leadership is such a web. It has so many, 110 conservative organizations helped do this. They have the network and scaffolding in place to make it like the closest thing I can compare it to is Gilead, which is just something that people can relate to if you know The Handmaid's Tale. And people
Yep.
wonder, well, ooh, that feels like it's possible and it's awfully close. Before there was Gilead, there was America. And Atwood used real Christian fundamentalists as her model. And she said that everything in the book has already actually taken place. So somewhere in the world and in these groups. So it's all completely plausible and the framework is there. And the only wild card truly is democracy. That's the only like I just read yesterday, Elon Musk is putting $43 million a month towards getting this administration through. And that seems like, oh, there's no way we can combat that. Like we're definitely going to lose. But the will of the people are still the thing that they don't have total control of. And it is the thing that can still turn that tide. Yeah, that's why we have to keep talking.
No, I'm so glad that you are connecting these dots and that you're willing to go there because so many people aren't. And if I showed you a world where Scientologists were becoming governors and senators and shaping laws in the direction of L. Ron Hubbard Day and L. Ron Hubbard recognitions and the national Scientology breakfast that all the senators are going to go to every year, right, in DC. And I started putting this all forward, people would be losing their goddamn minds.
Yeah.
But we put Christian on it and everybody just relaxes. And I don't understand why.
Go back to the indoctrination. So
I understand. Yeah. I'm just saying they right. should be relaxing. Everything I just described is what's happening with Christians now, right? But right. I use the word Scientologist to, it's what about other Christians though? See, aren't all Christians great? Isn't everybody just going to get along wonderfully in this future Gilead?
This is my favorite because I get this all the time online. Not all Christians are like this. And I'm like, okay, first of all, I know not all Christians are like this. That's true. Number two, they've totally hijacked your word. So if you want it back, you better go get it.
Yep.
Number three, survivor advocates do not have to cheerlead the ones doing it right. We're here to expose who's doing it wrong. But really, ultimately, no, they're not going to all get along. They're aligning en masse like this in order to get their power in place. But the ones who are on top are always going to be the purists with the power. It's not going to be the liberal Christians in New England are not going to have a seat at the table. That is not going to happen to you. If you have a different brand of Christianity that does, like the one I'm waiting for is the split between Protestants and Catholics. They aligned over abortion, each thinking the other's not a real Christian because they both have reasons. Like we've been at this for years. The Reformation was a long time ago. And when they get the power, when the Christians get the power, it's going to be interesting. Is Rome going to win? Probably not in America because Christian patriarchy evangelical patriarchy is what I've been calling it lately, is going to cancel the Catholics out. And the Catholics, they were just a vote for them.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. This is where interfaith becomes maybe not so much. Right. Scientology does the same thing, right? We're desperate for allies when we need them. And then as soon as, it's very, very much like foreign relations, right? Countries don't have friends. Countries have interests. Mm-hmm. And as long as we have mutual interests, we're allies. But as soon as we don't, we're going to kick you to the curb. And Catholics are absolutely a dying breed in the United States right now. A lot of people in and outside of Christian world saying good because of the Boston Spotlight articles and the decades and centuries of abuse. And people see that is the exact line that right now Christians are like, no. But when it becomes convenient, Catholics will scapegoated on that exact line, right? Let's get these ungodly, abusive Catholics out of here and make room for more of us pure Christians. And the purity culture is just ramped up to have that war in the future, right? That kind of thing is, I think, what we see in our future if this is allowed to go unchecked. So knowing what I mean, I think you and I are totally on the same page on this.
Same page.
Yeah, which is really refreshing. because we've had similar experiences and we can see past the
Right.
curtain, right? And a lot of people look at the curtain and go, but it's so pretty.
Right. Not so much.
And it's really not. It's hiding some really dark stuff, as your personal story attests to, as my personal story attests to. So, what's your view on how do we prevent this, or how do we prevent that Gilead future? How do we wake more people up? Obviously, you and I are doing everything we can, writing books, doing podcasts, getting the word out there. But what do you think needs to happen in the bigger picture? Or alternatively, what do you think individuals who are concerned about this maybe should be doing so that we don't have Gilead? Because I don't want that. And every fiber of my being is trying to fight against it.
Yeah, I think number one, just as we are, and we're privileged in this way that we have these kind of platforms, but awareness, spreading education. You mentioned the hit to the Catholic Church because of the Boston Globe. That's what we're doing in Protestant circles too. We're outing the abuse and we're sharing what the realities are behind closed doors, because that does illuminate the way for people to see, oh, this was the Wizard of Oz. This was not what I thought it was. So I think that just cannot be understated. Second of all, civic engagement. Like, Christianity has conditioned the last 50 years of people to not vote and to not be involved in their communities. Head of household voting is a real thing in the patriarchy, where the women are not allowed to vote. And so if Christian patriarchy comes to pass, it is very possible that women will be placing their last vote in 2024 and not be allowed. And that's not fear mongering. Listen to survivors. I was not allowed to vote in Christian patriarchy. So I have every reason to believe that if the Heritage Foundation is in charge of our elections, we will not be voting. So that kind of like empowerment, like get involved with your grassroots, get involved, like, it's just, I believe in the power of people. I believe in the power of stories and relationships, because relationships are what saved my life. That is what the human connection is, what made the difference. It helps us value a plural society. Like, my best friend was gay, and that became, or is gay, and that became the North Star for me to not buy into the rhetoric that I was saturated in. It was a human relationship that helped me see that light. And so that's what I hope to just continue amplifying, is these, they sound like nice ideals on the outside because they answer chaos, but they don't manifest the way that they promise. And the only way that we can prove that is by telling the stories and sharing the stories and being involved and being vocal and being engaged in our communities. Civic engagement is an American right and privilege, and it's really fallen from the vernacular. It's kind of a new word. And I'm like, no, civics used to be taught in school before the Christians got into our school boards.
That's right. That's
Yes.
right. We've never been in a position now where it really is, as Dickens wrote, this was the best of times. It was the worst of times, right?
Yeah.
Because in so many ways right now, because I have said before, and I'll sort of move toward wrapping up today with this and this wonderful discussion. Thank you again for taking the time to come here and talk about this stuff. And I do want to circle back to your book, but I wanted to say, just in wrapping up everything we've talked about here, that I don't think I'm engaging in hyperbolic thought when I say our rights are on the end of a thread. Mm-hmm. It can be pulled down just like that if we don't fight to keep them up there. And that's really what we're talking about, because we've had a view of the other side and what it really looks like when it gets bad. Mm-hmm. And it's really bad. And we don't want that for everybody. We don't want that at all. Mm-hmm. My summation, what would what would yours be? How do you want people to walk away from this conversation thinking about the things we've discussed today?
I want them to feel empowered and to feel affirmed that this is not fear mongering and this is not hyperbole when there's evidence and testimony attached to it. This is not a phantom fear that we're presenting. This is a testimonial. And so I think, even though we have to call on our courage in order to have these conversations and face this, when we know that it's real, we're reinforced. And so that's what I hope people take away, is that all this rhetoric that we're surrounded, this blustery hot air, and people, all this media on both sides, just no, stick to the stories, stick to the real survivors and the real knowledge and the evidences and the testimonies, um, and just knowing your heart that your instinct was right. People, I'm a big one in believing that we know in our guts who's telling the truth. It's external pressure that makes us question that or deny it, or do as we're the only species that does this, which will turn off our fear factor and our trauma response, and we will rationalize our way out of danger. To come back to your natural self and say, no, no, I don't actually want to live like it was 200 years ago. I understand what the founding fathers said. They wanted a pluralistic society, but they also were 200 years ago. They wanted us to advance. Let's advance. Let's be progressive. Let's have protopia. Let's move forward in the light. I don't want to go backwards. I don't want to be a Puritan. I don't want to be a colonial.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I like the modern world. I like toilet
Yes.
paper. I like enlightened principles. I like, my phone. I
Clean
science.
water.
Yeah, I like clean water. That's right. I like vaccines. I like the fact that we don't suffer from the plague anymore. These
Right.
are these are features to me, not bugs, right? And I don't
Right.
want to step backwards 300, 500, 3,000 years in our
Mhm.
social thinking or our religious thinking by, throwing all of these wonderful advancements to the trash heap because of some delusional, misbegotten idea of conservative religious values. That's just not how our world is now, and we need to kind of end that nonsense.
Right.
Okay. Now coming back to your book, Tia,
Yes.
what is it called? Where do people get it? When is
Yeah.
it coming out?
So, A Well-Trained Wife, it's available everywhere you buy books in hardcover, digital, or audio. I did read the audio myself. Everyone always asks that. It releases on August 6th, and I'm very, very excited. I hope you'll buy it. I hope you'll engage with me online, ask me questions, all of the things.
Awesome. And how do people reach you, contact you? Do you have a website?
Yep. TiaLevings.com is my main website. I'm a Tia Levings writer on all the social platforms. I'm highly engaged on social media. And TiaLevings.substack.com is my anti-fundamentalist exploration of breaking down fundamentalism in our headlines, culture, family, deconstruction process, the works.
Awesome. Awesome.
Thank you.
Tia, thank you.
You're
Um,
welcome.
I may reach out to you again. You have been a
Yes,
wonderful
let's be
guest.
friends.
Yes, let's. I'm down. I am down. All right, excellent. Folks out there, check out the book. I'm going to put links to her website there down below in the description section to this on YouTube and on my Podbean platform, so you all can get in touch with her, find out more, read her book, and learn about this. This is the time. We are in historic times right now. A lot of us don't want to be. I hear you. I don't want to be either. I love a nice, boring, sedate, wonderful life with technology and modern things, but people keep getting in the way. So we're just going to have to deal with that.
Just gonna
All
have
right.
to do
Folks. Just got it. Just got to. All right. I'll see you guys
it.
next week. Bye-bye.